Imagine this, it's midnight at Borgo Prison, Corsica, the kind of place nightmares are made of, old stone walls, echoing corridors, and a silence so deep you can hear your own heartbeat. I was a rookie guard back then, full of piss and vinegar, thinking I'd seen it all. I hadn't. That night, the air was different, heavy. The usual hum of the prison was gone, replaced by an unnerving quiet. My partner, a grizzled veteran named Luke, felt it too. He kept rubbing the back of his neck, his eyes darting into the shadows of cell block D. That's where they kept the worst of the worst. The ones the other inmates were scared of. We were on our final patrol before the shift change. As we walked past the cells, the silence was broken by a soft sound, a rhythmic tapping, tap, tap, tap. It came from the end of the block, from the solitary confinement cell. We called it the pit. The inmate inside was a mystery. No name, no record, just a number. They'd brought him in a week earlier, and since then, the entire block had been on edge. Luke grabbed his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice tight. He walked towards the pit, his footsteps the only sound besides that infernal tapping. I watched, my hand resting on my baton, my throat suddenly dry. The tapping stopped. Then, the main power cut out. The entire prison plunged into absolute darkness, and the emergency lights failed to kick in. A collective roar erupted from the inmates, a wave of chaos and fury. But over it all, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. It was a scream, Lutz's scream. It was short, sharp, and cut off in a way that's impossible to forget. In the chaos that followed, with alarms blaring and backup generators finally sputtering to life, we found Luke. He was outside the pit. The cell door was wide open, bent outwards as if from a massive force from within. Luke, what was left of him, was barely recognizable. The official report called it a riot, a tragic accident during a lockdown breach. But everyone who was there that night knew the truth. The inmate from the pit was gone, vanished. No one ever saw him again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I can still hear it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It's a reminder that some doors are better left closed, and some horrors are meant to stay locked away in the dark. Thanks for listening to my story. If you've ever worked a job with unexplained events, share your experience in the comments below. And if you want to hear more tales from the shadows, make sure to subscribe. Stay safe out there. They descended to the lower mechanical level, escorted by armed officers. The air smelled of oil and cold rust. At the far end of a dim corridor, behind stacked supply crates, they found it. A door, metal, unlocked. Rivas tested the key from Brenner's pocket. It fit. When the door creaked open, stale air rushed out like something exhaling after years of silence. Flashlights cut through darkness. Boot prints marked the dust. 3 distinct patterns, and a fourth. Someone else had been down there. Someone who knew exactly where the cameras couldn't see. Back upstairs, tension snapped like wire. The inmates in C block were restless. Rumors spread faster than official statements. Some claimed they heard guards arguing before the blackout. Others said Varga had been expecting something. Rivas requested Varga's file. Leon Varga, 38, former financial strategist turned crime syndicate coordinator. Known for manipulation rather than violence, intelligent, patient to patient. Silva was muscle, impulsive, short-tempered. Idris Kovic was the wild card, quiet, observant, rumored to have connections outside the country. 3 men who didn't appear aligned, unless someone aligned them. Inspector Kovic reviewed staff schedules. Only one guard had swapped shifts with Brenner that week. Officer Tomas Hale had called in sick that night. "Bring him in," she ordered. By evening, Borgo was a pressure cooker. Search teams combed every inch of the facility. Drones scanned the perimeter. Dogs were brought in. No sign of the inmates, no perimeter breach. Which meant one possibility. They're still inside, Rivas said again, though this time it felt less like reassurance and more like dread. Kovic stood in the central corridor, staring at the sealed tunnel door now under armed guard. "Order in this place wasn't maintained by force alone," she said quietly. "It was maintained by predictability." She turned to Ward. Someone disrupted that predictability from the inside. Her phone buzzed. Forensics had finished preliminary analysis on the control panel. Fingerprints recovered from beneath the console, not Brenner's. Not any of the 3 missing inmates. They belonged to a guard currently on active duty. Officer Daniel Rivas, Silence swallowed the room. Rivas felt every eye turn toward him. That's impossible, he said, voice steady but pale. I've never accessed that panel. Kovic held his gaze. Then why, she asked softly, are your prints on the mechanism that shut off the cameras for exactly 11 seconds? Outside, another siren wailed, this time from inside the prison yard. And as officers rushed toward the noise, a single message echoed through Borgo's internal radio system. Control is compromised. The machine wasn't just failing, it was being rewritten. And when they opened the old boiler room at the end of that hidden tunnel, what they found would change everything. When they opened the boiler room door, the smell hit first, not decay, not smoke, burned plastic. The old industrial chamber had long been stripped of its original machinery, but someone had recently been there. Extension cords snaked across the floor like veins. A portable battery rig hummed quietly in the corner. A scorched laptop sat on a steel crate, its casing partially melted, and spray-painted across the far concrete wall, in thick black strokes, were 3 words, "Order is a lie." Inspector Marakovic stepped forward slowly, boots echoing against the hollow floor. This wasn't a rushed escape, she said. This was a statement. Officer Daniel Rivas stood just behind her, silent. He could feel it now, suspicion tightening around him like cuffs. His fingerprints were on the sabotage panel. His name was circulating quietly among senior staff, and now this. The laptop was bagged and sent to digital forensics immediately. Initial assessment: the device had been connected to Borgo's internal network. That meant whoever was down here didn't just open doors, they rewrote access protocols. Warden Elias Ward ran both hands over his face. Our network isn't accessible without clearance codes. Then someone with clearance codes gave them, Kovic replied. Or someone was clearance. 2 hours later, Officer Tomas Hale sat in an interrogation room inside the administrative wing. Hale looked exhausted, pale skin, bloodshot eyes, and shaven jaw. He insisted he'd been homesick with a stomach virus. No witnesses. No doctor's note. You swapped shifts with Brenner 3 days ago, Kovic said calmly. Yeah, my kid had a school thing, Hale muttered. And then you called in sick the night he was killed. I can't control when I get sick. Kovic slid a printed still image across the table. The reflection captured from the control panel, the shadow behind Brenner before the cameras went dark. The figure's shoulders were broad. Similar build to Hale. That you? She asked. Hale stared at the image for a long time. No. You understand this is murder, he swallowed. Yeah. Then help us. Silence. But it wasn't fear in Holly's eyes. It was something closer to confusion. Meanwhile, forensic techs uncovered something even more disturbing from the boiler room. The laptop's hard drive had been partially destroyed, but fragments of code remained intact. Enough to show that someone had mapped out Borgo's surveillance blind spots months in advance. Someone had studied shift rotations, meal schedules, guard patrol patterns. It wasn't a spontaneous breakout. It was a long-term infiltration, and the most unsettling part. The system logs showed remote access credentials, authorized ones had been used. Credentials belonging to Officer Carl Brenner, the dead man. Rivas stood alone in the locker room, staring at his reflection. He replayed the past week in his mind. Had he touched that control panel? Maybe during training, maybe during maintenance. No, he would remember, unless someone planted it. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A known number. He hesitated, then answered. No voice, just breathing. Then a whisper. You're looking in the wrong direction. The line went dead. Rivas froze. He immediately reported the call to Kovic. Trace it, she ordered. But it had been routed through an internal extension. Inside Borgo, the caller hadn't escaped. They were still there. In C Block, tension reached a breaking point. Inmates banged on their bars, demanding answers. Some shouted that the guards had orchestrated the escape themselves. Others claimed they'd seen Brenner arguing with Varga days earlier. Rumors were turning into weapons, and Borgo's greatest strength order was eroding. Kovic gathered the senior guards in the briefing room. Let's stop pretending this is just about 3 inmates, she said. Someone inside this facility has been manipulating systems, planting evidence, and staging a coordinated breach. She let that settle. If this is a guard, they're still armed and moving freely. Eyes shifted across the room. Trust was evaporating. Digital forensics delivered their next blow just before midnight. They had recovered a partial message from the burned laptop, not an email, not a manifesto. A scheduled command. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the same time as the blackout, the laptop triggered a localized system override. But here's the detail that chilled everyone. The override wasn't designed to open only cell 118. It was programmed to open every high-risk cell in C block, all of them. But only one opened. Why? Ward demanded. The technician hesitated. Because someone manually stopped the cascade. Who? The logs showed a manual interruption command entered 2 seconds after the blackout. From the control panel, using Brenner's credentials. Meaning one of two things. Either Brenner tried to stop it, or someone used his access to make it look that way. Kovic returned to the boiler room alone. She stood in front of the painted message again. Order is a lie. She didn't see rage in it. She saw philosophy. This wasn't about escape. It was about exposure. If all high-risk cells had opened at once, Borgo would have descended into uncontrollable violence. National headlines, political disaster. Instead, only 3 inmates disappeared. Selective chaos, calculated damage. Someone wanted to prove they could break the system, but chose not to fully destroy it. Why? Her radio crackled. Inspector, you need to see this. In the medical wing, a nurse stood trembling beside a supply cart. Inside one of the locked cabinets, taped beneath a tray of sterile gloves, they found a folded piece of paper, printed on standard prison letterhead. It contained a list of guard names, not random, shift supervisors, including Rivas. Next to each name was a number. Time stamps, dates, surveillance notes. Someone had been tracking the trackers. And at the bottom of the page, written by hand, you don't maintain order. You manufacture it. Rivas stared at the list. His name had the most entries. You think I'm involved, he said quietly to Kovic. I think someone wants us to think you are, she replied. Before he could respond, alarms blared again. Not from C block, from administrative security. Unauthorized access attempt in records archive. Officers flooded the corridor. By the time they reached the archive room, the door was ajar. Inside, file cabinets stood open. Brenner's personnel file lay on the table, missing pages. Specifically, disciplinary reports from 5 years earlier. Kovic turned slowly. Why would someone erase part of a dead man's record? Ward's face had gone ashen, because 5 years earlier, there had been an internal investigation. A complaint filed by an inmate claiming excessive force. The complaint had been dismissed. The inmate, Leon Varga, the first man whose cell opened. Silence settled heavy in the room. This isn't random, Kovic said. This is personal. Rivas leaned against the desk, processing it. Varga waited 5 years. Or someone waited with him. A guard cleared his throat from the doorway. Inspector, we just did a thermal sweep of the lower maintenance tunnels. And there's heat movement. Where? The guard hesitated. Between C block and solitary confinement. Kovac's pulse quickened. Solitary was the most secure section in Borgo. Isolated cells. Independent power supply. Minimal camera coverage because of the thick concrete walls. If someone had rerouted through the old tunnels. They're not trying to escape, Rivas whispered. They're repositioning, Kovic said. Armed response teams moved toward solitary. The corridor lights flickered as they approached. And then, just as they reached the heavy steel door, the entire block went dark. Emergency lights kicked in seconds later. The door to solitary stood open. Inside, one cell was empty. Not one of the missing 3. This cell belonged to a different inmate entirely. An inmate who had been transferred to solitary 2 weeks ago for threatening staff. Name, Officer Tomas Halley's brother. Former correctional officer, convicted for evidence tampering. As the realization hit, a voice echoed faintly from somewhere deep within the tunnel system. Calm, controlled. You wanted to know how order is maintained in Borgo. A pause. It isn't. And somewhere in the dark beneath the prison, a metal door slammed shut. The metal door echoed like a gunshot through the tunnels. Armed officers surged forward, boots pounding against the concrete, flashlights cutting sharp white beams through the dark. The air down there was colder, heavier, thick with rust and something else. Planning. Inspector Marakovic moved with them, weapon drawn but mind racing faster than the team ahead of her. This wasn't an escape anymore. It was choreography, thermal reading. She demanded into her radio. 3 heat signatures moving north tunnel. 1 stationary. North tunnel led toward the decommissioned intake wing, an abandoned section, originally designed for inmate processing decades ago. It had its own security controls, disconnected from the modern system during renovations. Isolated, contained, perfect for a demonstration. When the team reached the intake corridor, they found the first body. Leon Varga. He was alive, barely, zip-tied to a steel chair in the center of the hallway. A gag bound his mouth. His eyes were wide, furious, humiliated. He hadn't escaped. He'd been staged. Kovic ripped the gag free. "Where are the others?" she demanded. Varga coughed, struggling to breathe. "This wasn't the plan," he rasped. "What plan?" He said he'd expose them. "Not," he cut himself off, jaw clenching. "Not what?" Rivas pressed. "Not turn us into bait." Footsteps echoed from deeper inside the wing. Slow, measured, then a voice. "You still think this was about freedom?" Officer Tomas Hale stepped into the dim emergency lighting. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood his brother, Mark Hale, the former correctional officer convicted of evidence tampering. Supposedly disgraced, supposedly bitter, Mark's face was calm, almost serene. "You wanted to know how guards maintain order," Mark said, eyes locking onto Kovic. "Now you're standing inside it." Weapons aimed at them instantly. "Drop your hands," an officer shouted. But Tomas raised his palms casually. He wasn't holding a weapon. "That's the illusion," Tomas said quietly. "You think control comes from force. It doesn't." Kovic stepped forward. "You orchestrated this," Mark smiled faintly. "No. We revealed it." Behind them, Mateo Silva stumbled out from a side corridor, bruised, terrified, hands bound. Idris Kovic followed, similarly restrained. They weren't co-conspirators, they were props. "You killed Brenner," Rivas said, voice low. Mark's expression shifted, not to guilt, but to something heavier. "No," he said. "Carl killed himself." The words hit like a slap. "That's a lie," word snapped from behind the officers. Mark tilted his head. "Check the autopsy." Silence. Kovic didn't blink. "Explain." Mark exhaled slowly. 5 years ago, Varga filed a complaint. Excessive force. It was true. Brenner beat him in the lower corridor. No cameras back then. Internal affairs buried it. I was the one who adjusted the footage timeline to protect him. "You tampered with evidence," Kovic said. "Yes," Mark replied evenly. "To maintain order." He looked around the abandoned wing. "That's what we always told ourselves. Protect the image, protect the structure. Because if inmates believe the system is corrupt, control collapses." Tomas spoke next, voice strained. "Carl carried that guilt. He drank. He spiraled. When Mark was convicted, Carl thought it was his fault. And this week?" Kovic asked. Mark nodded toward Varga. "Leon found out. He'd been digging for years. He threatened to expose everything publicly through contacts outside. So Brenner panicked," Rivas said quietly. "Yes," Mark answered. "He accessed the system that night. He meant to open every high-risk cell." Ward's face twisted. "That's insane." "It's desperation," Mark corrected. "If chaos exploded, investigations would focus on the riot, not old misconduct. Files disappear in disasters." The weight of it settled over the room. "But he couldn't go through with it," Kovic said. Mark's eyes darkened. "He shut it down after opening Varga's cell," they argued. "I was already in the tunnel. I'd been helping Varga gather proof. I didn't know Carl would escalate. You expect us to believe this?" Ward barked. Mark ignored him. Carl realized what he'd done. Realized it would all unravel anyway, so he staged it to look like an attack. Rivas felt his stomach drop. "The angle of the wound. Self-inflicted," Mark said softly. But positioned to implicate Varga, to preserve the narrative. The silence was suffocating. "And the planted fingerprints on Rivas?" Kovic asked. Tomas answered this time. "That was me." Every officer's weapon shifted slightly. "I accessed the control panel during training last month," Tomas continued, lifted partial prints. "I needed a misdirection, someone competent, someone believable." Rivas stared at him. "You framed me." "I needed time," Tomas said. "Time to get my brother into solitary. Time to move Varga and the others without triggering full lockdown." "You murdered a man's reputation," Rivas said. "No," Mark interrupted. "Carl did that himself." Kovic processed rapidly. "So what was the goal?" she asked, "if not escape?" Mark looked at the painted words on the far wall of the intake wing, the same phrase from the boiler room, now stenciled again in smaller letters. "Order is a lie," he said, "was exposure." He gestured toward the bound inmates. They weren't partners, they were leverage. If Borgo erupted, outside agencies would audit everything: past cases, internal reviews, buried complaints. Ward's voice trembled with anger. You risked lives, and you buried truths, Mark shot back. For a moment, no one moved. Then Kovic lowered her weapon slightly. You're both under arrest, she said calmly. For conspiracy, obstruction, and facilitating a security breach. Tomas didn't resist when officers cuffed him. Mark, however, held Kovac's gaze one last time. You think arresting us restores order? He asked quietly. It restores accountability, she replied. He almost smiled. Same illusion, different uniform. 3 weeks later, Borgo Prison was quieter than it had ever been. Not orderly, quiet. The investigation confirmed parts of Mark's story. Forensic analysis supported the possibility of self-inflicted injury in Brenner's case, though officially it remained undetermined pending review. Internal Affairs reopened Varga's old complaint. Warden Elias Ward resigned before formal charges could surface regarding systemic negligence. Officer Tomas Hale faced multiple counts. Mark Hale faced additional charges for orchestrating the breach. Leon Varga and the other inmates were transferred to separate federal facilities. Officer Daniel Rivas was cleared of involvement, but clearance didn't feel like victory. On his final night shift before requesting transfer, Rivas stood alone in C Block. The walls looked the same, the bars, the lights, the routines, everything intact, but something invisible had cracked. Order, he realized, had never meant fairness. It meant predictability, and predictability could be manufactured. As he turned to leave, he noticed something scratch faintly into the underside of the railing, so small it would vag on unnoticed without the flashlight beam catching it. 3 words, different handwriting, different message: control is earned. Rivas stared at it for a long time, not defiant, not angry, just present. Somewhere beyond the prison walls, Mark Hale sat in a holding facility awaiting trial. News outlets debated corruption inside correctional systems. Commentators argued over whether his actions were whistleblowing or terrorism. But inside Borgo, routines resumed, meals served, cells locked, shifts rotated. And yet, every guard now understood something they hadn't before. Order wasn't a wall, it was a story. And the moment enough people stopped believing it, it could fall apart from the inside. Months later, during a federal audit of archived case files, investigators uncovered something no one had expected: a second sealed complaint, filed anonymously. Dated 2 days before Brenner's death, alleging misconduct, not by Brenner, but by another senior officer still on active duty. The signature line was blank. The handwriting didn't match Varga, or Mark, or Tomas, meaning someone else had been watching, someone else had been waiting. And as Borgo Prison prepared its official public report declaring institutional stability fully restored, one quiet truth lingered in the concrete corridors: they had exposed one crack in the system. But they had not found them all. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for what hides behind the next locked door. Subscribe, because some prisons don't just hold criminals, they hold secrets.